It's going to be 116 degrees today in Gilbert, Arizona. And I don't know why I share that with you, but it's going to be a hot one. I don't know where you're quarantining, but my best to you. I want to tell a story today, and I know we've gotten some response that said that families are watching with kids, and so I'm going to tell a story about the Rich Man and Lazarus today, and we'll see how to take a story that Jesus tells in the right way and in the wrong way, and maybe it'll help us with our own understanding of how to read the Bible. That much and more coming up. So welcome to Church Without Walls. I'm going to be taking you to the Gospel of Luke in a moment. And if you're looking, you want to follow along online, it'll be in chapter 16, right around the 19th verse, a story that Jesus tells called the Rich Man and Lazarus. And this is a story, maybe I should just jump right into it and share it with you, and then we'll back away from it a little bit and see what we can learn. I think it's actually really relevant in our day because it'll help us understand the way Jesus was teaching. I mean, he was a rabbi, right? And so one of the first things you need to know about the story is that it's not original to Jesus. This is one, there were many things that he talked about that were original, at least that we believe were original. But then there were stories that were popular amongst the rabbis of his day that he took and he told or retold, and he took a different angle or drew out a different truth. And this is what rabbis did, and it's even what rabbis do today. So this story, the Rich Man and Lazarus, had roughly, as far as we know, about three versions. You're going to hear the one Jesus tells today, but about three versions floating around from the Second Temple period of Jewish history, which culminated in Jesus arriving and overturning the tables of everything traditional Jewish at that time. So he tells a story that would be familiar in the ears of the hearers, and he puts his own signature on it. And the story is just the Rich Man and Lazarus. And when Peyton today was asking, what should she do? I said, well, the story I'm going to tell is, and I told her the story, and it looks like we're doing paint again this week. Cool. Very cool. But anyway, the story I told Peyton, I'll just tell you briefly real quick, and then maybe we'll look at it and talk about it. But the Rich Man and Lazarus is as the title, it's about two people. One was a rich man, and Lazarus isn't the one that is greatly known from the Bible. It's not the friend of Jesus who was wealthy, and who Jesus raised from the dead, but it was a poor man, a beggar, somebody who lived in the streets. And the connection with Lazarus and the rich man, who you hear about in this story, is that Lazarus would often find himself dumpster diving outside of the rich man's house. The rich man, of course, had a lot of physical blessing, and so his house probably was a place of entertainment. He had servants, a lot of people there. There would have been a lot of food consumed there daily, and a lot probably thrown out. And Lazarus would dumpster dive to have something to eat. And we're told in the story, and it's a story, and Jesus liked to do this, is give the two ends of the continuum, the two extremes in a story to draw out truth. And it's a form of hyperbole, and that's what parables do sometimes. And the two extremes in the story is how poor Lazarus was and how rich the wealthy man was and how good he had it on earth. And we're told about Lazarus that he was so poor that, like, the highlight of his whole life, however many years it was, let's just imagine he lived 35 years, which is roughly an average. 29 years, I think, might have been an average in that day. And let's just say he lived, 30 years and died. And the best part of waking up was not Folgers in his cup. The best moment of this guy's life was when wild dogs would come up to him in the gutter and they would lick his sores, because his body, like Job, figured a Job-like character. He was covered in sores, and the dogs would lick his sores, and that gave him some relief. And that's what we're told. I mean, the hyperbole of the parable, that's the best he got it. Maybe a few crumbs from the rich man's garbage and the dogs licking his sores. This was his health care and his sustenance on earth. But he was a believer in God. He was a God-fearer. He was somebody who loved God in spite of that. And so when he died, the story goes, he was carried by angels into the place of the dead that the Jews referred to as paradise. It was part of Hades. That's not just a Greek thing. Hades is often translated hell in your English versions or in the King James, but there are 3-4 different words that translate into hell in the King James Bible, stuff like that. I mean, you have Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom. You have Sheol, and Hades in the New Testament, Tartarus even. And they translate all those different words as hell, which is a misnomer. But so you have him carried to the lust side of Hades. And when the rich man dies, he just shows up, and English Bibles say hell wasn't hell. It's the other side of the river Styx, you might say, the judgment side of Hades. And he's in kind of like a purgatory. He's in flame, apparently, and he's suffering. And so he looks across this chasm, a river to the Greeks, chasm to the Jews. He looks across this chasm and he sees the beggar whom he used to see when he'd come out of his mansion and go about his business, and maybe once in a while throw a crumb to, or I don't know. Maybe he never treated Lazarus well, but he sees Lazarus next to pretty much one of the titans of Jewish history, right? He sees Lazarus reclining in the bosom of Abraham, and they're having a great chat, or they're having fellowship. And this is like the height of what you could imagine death would be like. You go in and you meet the patriarchs, you sleep with the fathers, but not only do you sleep with the fathers, you're hanging out with the guy, right? Which was, Abraham. What's next on Mount Rushmore for a Jew? Moses. It's Abraham, Moses, maybe Elijah. And this poor, this pathetic creature, this bum, this Skid Row bum, is cloistered with Father Abraham. And so the rich man calls out across the chasm. Apparently they could talk, like it's an old New York street. But the rich man's on the wrong side of the tracks, and he yells out to Abraham. He says, "Abraham, can you send the servant, send Lazarus, to dip his finger in water and bring it, because I'm so parched, I'm so thirsty." Now, I'm going to talk about what the story has devolved into later, but at the time Jesus told it, there wasn't an argument over, is this hell? Because the Jew had no conception of hell. None. Zero. There was no hell in the Old Testament. It's become that in our modern times, so just put that out of your mind for right now. So Jesus is telling the story, and the rich man asks for some relief, some personal relief, because he's He's in the flames and in the dark place of Hades, and he wants some personal comfort. Now he's in a situation that was much like Lazarus was on earth all this time. And Abraham learns him up. He says, look, even if we wanted to, we can't. We can't cross this chasm. There's a great gulf between us, and I can't cross it, and I can't send Lazarus, and we can't help you. Sorry. And then when he realizes he can't get any personal relief, he does something pretty honorable. He says, well, if I can't find relief, I still have brothers that are alive, right? And I don't want them to come here. I don't want them to share in this misery. I don't want their, final destiny to end up in this place of woe. Would you consider sending Lazarus back to them, right? To tell them about this place so they don't make the same mistake I did. It's a noble thing. Abraham again says, no, look, sorry to break this to you, but even if it were possible for a man to rise from the dead, even if, God approved this and sent Lazarus back, your brothers wouldn't hear him. They wouldn't. Even somebody who rose from the dead and brought this message to them, if they haven't already believed the miracle of Moses and the prophets, if they have already heard Moses and the prophets and rejected it, they're not going to believe it, even if somebody rises from the dead and tells them. Wow. So this is the story Jesus tells. And I gave you my version, but let me kind of read it to you quickly, all right? And we'll share it with you here on the screen. There once was a rich man, expensively dressed in the latest fashions, wasting his days in conspicuous consumption. This is Jesus talking about this. And a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, he had been dumped on his doorstep, and all he lived for was to get a meal from scraps off the rich man's table. And his best friends were the dogs who came and licked his sores. And then he died, and this poor man was taken up by the angels to the lap of Abraham. Abraham's bosom was kind of a nickname for this paradise in Hades. And the rich man also died and was buried, and in hell and in torment. Now this is Eugene Peterson's translation in the Message Bible. It's not Gehenna, but in Hades and in torment. He looked up and saw Abraham in the distance and Lazarus in his lap. He called out, "Father Abraham, show mercy. Send Lazarus to dip his finger in water to cool my tongue. I'm in agony in this fire." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that in your lifetime you got the good things, and Lazarus the bad things. It's not like that here. Here he's consoled, and you're tormented. Besides, in all these matters there's a huge chasm set between us, so that no one can go from us to you, even if he wanted to, nor can anyone cross over from you to us." The rich man said, "Then let me ask you, Father, send him to the house of my father, where I have 5 brothers, so he can tell them the score and warn them so they won't end up here in this place of torment." And Abraham answered, "Well, they have Moses and the prophets to tell them the score. Let them listen to them." "I know, Father Abraham," he said, "but they're not listening. And if someone came back to them from the dead, they would change their ways." And Abraham replied, "If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to be convinced by someone who rises from the dead." I check in on Peyton Cam. Nice. Okay. So Jesus tells it better than I do. But you have this story. Now, look, what Jesus was communicating is, if you've never heard this before, if you've never been in Christian circles, if you've never Googled or YouTubed the rich man and the Lazarus, it's going to be an easy story to decipher. It's not an enigma. It's not a great paradox, which sometimes Jesus talked in enigma and paradox. This one is just straight out there, a popular teaching that Jesus had done multiple times. And he's teaching two main things here. Oftentimes a parable would teach more than one main thing, but he's teaching two main things here. And if you just take the text and read it, and you're not already poisoned by what's on the internet or what you grew up with in Sunday school, then it comes clear to you, especially if you're familiar with Jesus' teachings, what he's trying to say. The first thing he's trying to say is something he put into a bumper sticker at one point in his teaching. It's something that could fit in a Twitter feed. Jesus tweeted. And he said on multiple occasions, although it's recorded in Scripture, he said, "What profit a man who gains the whole world but loses his soul?" This is the main teaching of the rich man and Lazarus. And so he's giving some heft to that bumper sticker, to that meme, if you will. What profit a man who gains the whole world? So this rich man had the whole world at his fingertips. And yet, when he died and his soul was required of him, all that meant nothing. It was nothing, because our lives here are short. There is, like Scripture says, the wind over somebody's cheek, or the falling of a leaf, or the flight of an arrow, right? Life is short. Life is fragile. And so Jesus is teaching again, what profit a man if he has everything on earth, and yet when he dies and his soul is required of him, he's found wanting. That's the main thrust of this story, right? There's a secondary thrust that's very powerful, and that plays out. And I want to tell you that in a moment, but first I want to tell you what the story means today, and how people can take something that's so simple and be distracted by lesser things, chasing rabbits down holes that the author never intended. And so if you go to YouTube and you type in the Rich Man and Lazarus, or go to Google and you type in the Rich Man and Lazarus, what you'll find is an inter-family food fight over the nature of hell. That the argument over this story is that Jesus was talking about hell, and so people will say, so is this hell, or is this something else? Is this purgatory? Is it Hades? Is the fire real? Is the torment forever? Is this Jesus proving and arguing for eternal conscious torment? And so that's what the whole argument. And now that's not something the Jews would have heard when Jesus told the story. That's not an argument they ever had. As a matter of fact, we know that, because if we read what the early church wrote about this, this type of argument that you'll find on YouTube and Google didn't show up until recently, right? And this is how the truth is sucked out of a beautiful story by theologians and by people who are distracted by petty arguments. And this is how, forgive me for sounding like the church lady for a moment, this is how Satan wins. Yes, I said it, Satan. Because this is what happens with Genesis too, where people try to make Genesis about science and not about theology. And the food fight becomes over. Is it 6 literal 24-hour days, or is it 6 long periods of time? Or does firmament mean, a hard covering over the earth, or a vapor canopy? And they get caught up in this minutia that the author never intended. And what happens is the beauty, the truth, and the good gets sucked out of it and left on the wayside. And we miss the whole point of the story. So Jesus' main point of the story was not to talk about hell or hellfire, or the nature of the afterlife, or is eternal conscious torment more biblically correct than annihilationism or universalism. Not the nature of the story at all. He was trying to communicate, what profit a man who gains the whole world and loses his soul? That was the main thing, and that's not the topic anymore of discussion. But Jesus was a good rabbi, right? Jesus was somebody who knew how to keep the attention of his audience, and he knew how to set a story that would be something that they'd chew on for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week. That's what rabbis did. As a matter of fact, we have this today still. We still have rabbis that do this today. As a matter of fact, the most famous rabbi in the world today isn't Jewish. He's an agnostic Canadian psychologist named, what is his name, honey? Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson. And so Jordan Peterson does just that. He takes Old Testament stories and he drags truth out of them, Carl Jung style. And this is what rabbis did in the time of Jesus. This is what Jesus is doing. His second main point, which completely goes unnoticed, along with the first one in our day, because we're consumed with lesser theology, with distraction theology, is that there is a willful ignorance that is manifest in certain people who get to a point where their heart is so hardened, they're not looking for evidence. They're not reasonable anymore. They're beyond reason. And even if they're presented with the most compelling evidence, like somebody rising from the dead and speaking to them from beyond, they won't be moved. In other words, miracles won't move these guys. They'll dismiss them. Now, was this true? Now we could talk about, would this be true? You know, it wasn't true with Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus witnessed the miracle on the Damascus Road, and he completely changed his trajectory, right? And his life was revolutionized. And he went from one extreme to another. He went from the greatest enemy of the church to the leader of the church, and somebody who was rounding up Christians to kill and to convict, to somebody who was sowing seed to grow more Christians, right? To raise more disciples and so forth. And so not every person is like this. Not every person hardens their heart over time, so much so that they become like Pharaoh. But the story is saying that basically, if these 5 brothers of the rich man had not hearkened to their heritage and their tradition that they were taught from their holy writings, from Moses and the prophets, they're not going to be moved by somebody who rises from the dead. Now, is this true? Jesus told this story, and he told the story late in his career. So he was just about to, guess what? He was just about to give the rich man his wish. Abraham couldn't do it. Abraham could not breach the chasm that exists between the dead and the living. But Jesus Christ could, and he did. And he spoke to the spirits in prison, and C.S. Lewis believed that because spirits are in a timeless state, that everyone who died apart from Christ spoke to during those 3 days. And I kind of lean toward that. I think that's a beautiful saying. And then he led captivity captive and drew them out. But Jesus Christ can breach that chasm, and Jesus Christ did raise Lazarus. He didn't raise the one that you've just heard of in Luke 16, the one with the sores on his body that the dogs licked, eating the scraps from the rich man's dumpster. He raised his friend, Lazarus, and you've read about this, you've heard about this in the Gospel of John, where Jesus raises Lazarus. Now, what happens? What was the result of the raising of Lazarus? Well, we find out that a lot of people were moved by it and convinced by it that Jesus was more than what people were saying about him, and they were attracted to him. We know this from the evidence in the Gospels, where it was also an incitement to those who didn't like Jesus and wanted him gone, who thought he was a problem, and basically the Sanhedrin. So what happens? You have a large group of people in Jerusalem and the Judean area who are moved by the raising of Lazarus, and they're flocking to Jesus. And then you have a small group of people who are in control, the Bible thumpers, the people who know the Bible better than the rabble in the road, and the people who are using the Bible for power and for political reasons, the people who are fighting for a kingdom in this world. Does this sound familiar to you? We live in the exact same situation as the situation that Jesus entered into in first century Judea. Bible believers thinking that the Bible's going to get them a seat at the table of temporal power in governments. And we fight for a kingdom that Jesus says is fleeting and is a distraction. We fight for a kingdom that Jesus was offered by Satan himself and refused. And we make deals. Who do you think we're making those deals with? To accrue power in a kingdom that Jesus didn't die for and didn't rise again for. But Christians get distracted as the very people who crucified Christ. But anyway, so Jesus actually raises Lazarus. And what does it do? It's the very incitement. It's the last straw, the metaphorical last straw, if you will, for the Sanhedrin. A group of men who were plotting the death of Jesus, but said up to that point, we can't kill him when Jerusalem's crowded. We can't kill him during a feast because there's just too many people here and it could, create an uprising and it's just too risky. Let's do it on a quiet, sleepy, summer day where no one's paying attention. And yet all of a sudden Jesus raises Lazarus and it incites them and they say, if we don't do something now, all of Jerusalem will follow him. We better do it now. 30 pieces of silver, blah, blah, blah. Pilate, crucify. Give us Barabbas. That's the end of the story. So, was the truth that Jesus was telling, the secondary truth that Jesus was telling in the story, true? Did it play out to be true in the very life and death of Jesus? It does. The Sanhedrin had a heart like Pharaoh. In other words, in the face of greater and greater and greater evidence, in the face of even the miraculous, Pharaoh hardens his heart against all reason and against all faith. So sometimes it's not scripture and logic that can convince the heart of heart. Now, our Christian apologists could take a lesson here because Gary Habermas, who I love, he's an apologist that talks about the resurrection. His greatest work, I think, is about human doubt, is about psychological doubt. And he teaches us, and it's not original to him, it actually comes from secular psychologists who have written that there's really 3 levels of doubt in the human psyche. There's intellectual doubt. This is the one we all recognize. Intellectual doubt is where, we have questions about something that we're not informed about. We're looking for more information. When we get that information, we make a healthy decision about it by weighing the evidence. And so, something sounds a little bit abstract and we have surface questions to it, but when those questions get answered by a presentation of deeper evidence, we're satisfied and we end up trusting or believing in it. This is intellectual doubt. It's looking for something tangible. It's looking for answers to intellectual questions. But that's not the doubt we deal with most times. The most prevalent doubt is the next level of doubt, which is emotional doubt. Emotional doubt often presents itself as fear. We've grown up in Plato's cave. We've grown up believing superstition. We've grown up believing stories that were passed down to us from our fathers and our fathers' fathers and our most beloved people in our lives, so we take it as gospel. And yet there's some cognitive dissonance because reality is telling us a different story. Reality is saying that the shadows aren't real. There's something beyond the shadows that are real. And we're hearing noise behind us. And we're told not to turn around by those who we grew up with, our Sunday school teachers, our pastors, our youth pastors, our dad. And so emotionally, we're tied to falsehood. And we don't want to turn around because we've been taught to fear that this evidence, this other side of the story. And not a lot of people can get beyond emotional doubt. But when somebody who's in emotional doubt is presented with evidence, it means nothing to them. They don't even consider it. They don't hear it. It goes literally in one ear and out the other because they're not looking for answers. They're trying to maintain status quo. And it's not always comfort. They think it's comfort. It's actually a state of anxiety that they've grown comfortable in. And they don't know what it would be like to be free. This is a psychological thing that happens to slaves that are freed, or to somebody who's held hostage. You know, you've heard of the syndrome that happens to people who are held hostage for a long period of time, and they create a bond between them and their captive, the Stockholm syndrome, and how it's difficult for them to come out of that. Same thing with people who are in cults. They have to go through a period of deprogramming or deconstruction to become whole, and to deal with reality in a healthy way. So emotional doubt is another level of doubt that's very hard to overcome. And so the first thing you have to do when you're dealing with somebody, even if it's your own children, is ask yourself, is there barrier to understanding this intellectual or emotional? Because if it's emotional, me presenting them information will be like giving water to somebody who's not thirsty. Right? The worst level of doubt, though, is not emotional doubt. It's volitional doubt. It's what we call willful ignorance. And it's a state of hardness that builds up over time like a callus on a hand. And over time, the more you say no to the truth, your ears shrink, the less you hear it, and the less you see it. And it's basically like saying talk to the hand, or putting your fingers in your ears and saying la 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 la. Volitional doubt becomes an expression of pride. And so on the continuum of doubt, on the very end, somebody who has intellectual doubt still has humility and still would be able to be convinced that maybe he's wrong, or maybe this other way that he hadn't considered is right. And it takes humility for that. On the very far end of the continuum, passing through emotional doubt and arriving at volitional doubt, is ultimately a state of pride that is fortified not only by ignorance but by arrogance. And this person is almost impenetrable. And this is the person Jesus is talking about in the Rich Man and Lazarus. And this is the person that Pharaoh was in the Bible. And this is the people that the Sanhedrin was. That they didn't dispute the raising of Lazarus. They not only accepted it, but they were incited by it to kill Jesus. And not only to kill Jesus. If you read about this in John's account, they didn't just want to kill Jesus. This was a Sopranos-like reaction, like a Tony Soprano. They said, let's not only kill Jesus, but let's put a contract out on Lazarus. Let's get rid of the evidence. What a reaction. This is like Herod's reaction when he finds out that the prophecy of the king of Israel is going to be Bethlehem. What was his reaction? To go and to bow himself down and to worship, or to send out soldiers to massacre the innocents? So now, folks, the stunning thing, this is what wisdom enters in, is when you're talking with people, before you ever answer the surface question, you have to ask yourself, is this person in a state of intellectual doubt, emotional doubt, or volitional doubt? Because if it's emotional and volitional, they're not looking for information. They're not looking for an answer to the question they posed. They posed that question as a gotcha or as a defense mechanism. They're being passively aggressive in an emotional state, or they're being outright hostile in a volitional state. And if you keep feeding them information, you'll just get them more angry to the point where they're going to end up killing you or blocking you from their Facebook page, or not inviting you to the family reunion, writing you out of their will. And then you get to the point where Oscar Wilde teaches us what true wisdom is. He said, if you tell some people the truth, they'll kill you. So if you're going to tell the truth, make it funny, make it humorous. And at least you'll have some protection, right? Well, Jesus didn't take Oscar Wilde's advice, and they killed him. And so to the martyrs, Stephen and others. And sometimes they kill you even if you're funny, right? Because they don't have share a sense of humor. So these are the two things that Jesus tells this story for. What profit a man who gain the whole world and lose his soul? And look, there's a state of man, of doubt in man, that is so fixed, not even I can penetrate it. Not even somebody who rises from the dead, who brings the gospel message, can penetrate it. It'll just incite greater violence or greater rejection. This is why Jesus was able to say in Matthew chapter 7, in such a powerful passage, and some in the world love this passage because it's Jesus starts out with, "Judge not, lest you should be judged." Jesus is condemning a lot of judgment that takes place under his name in Christian circles. We're never told to judge our neighbor. You never find Jesus judging the profligate. Jesus doesn't condemn the sinner and applaud the righteous. Jesus comes to encourage the broken and to indict the self-righteous. This is what he does. This is what he says. He says, "I'm a physician coming to the sick." He's not a judge coming to the sick. He's a physician coming to the sick. This is the day of salvation where he calls us to bind up the wounded, not to curse them. Right? Jesus openly says to his servants in the field, "Don't pull up the harvest yet. Your job isn't to pull up the tares and the wheat. You can't discern the two. That's above your pay grade. So, sit back until the until my angels come with the harvest." But so here's something we can learn. In that passage where Jesus says, "Judge not, lest you be judged." Oh, checking on him, Peyton. Wow, that filled in fast. We're going to come to you in just a second, okay? Are you done? Beautiful. All right, we'll be back to you in just a second. So in that passage in Matthew 7:1, Jesus says, "Judge not, lest you be judged." But a few verses later, he tells you who to judge. He does. He tells you who to judge. He says, "Cast not your pearls before swine," because they'll stomp on them, and then they'll rend you. They'll attack you. A swine, a pig, a hog in sloth doesn't see the value of a diamond, which is the wisdom you're offering them, the intellectual answers you're offering the volitional doubtful. They don't take it as wisdom. They take it as an insult. It's an incitement. It's the red cape that the bullfighter waves in front of the bull. That's your wisdom. That's how they take it. And they want acorns. And when you throw them diamonds, they can't eat diamonds. They'll chew it and find out it's not an acorn, and then they'll get mad at you thinking you're teasing them, and they'll attack you viciously. So Jesus is basically telling you to make a judgment about your audience. He's like, don't waste your... And you'll notice that Jesus did this. Jesus didn't answer every question that was posed to him. Rarely would Jesus answer gotcha questions or questions that were expressing volitional doubt. He'd weigh the question first. And he oftentimes would answer with other questions. And so Jesus would have you, and so would Socrates, by the way, weigh not just the question, but the questioner.
And sometimes it takes a few questions to realize the disposition of the person you're in a conversation with. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you could see they're spitting angry and they're ready to stone you now. And you don't need to answer those questions. As a matter of fact, anything that comes out of your mouth at that point is going to be a waste of time. And in the age of social media, you see this a lot. I was just involved in one of these conversations with somebody who thinks it's their God-given right not to wear a mask. And it is. You have volition. You don't have to wear a mask. But don't, you're not doing Jesus any favors by raising your middle finger, by robing yourselves in your American flag and raising your middle finger to your neighbors in the name of Jesus and the First Amendment. You're not doing America any good, and you're not doing Jesus any good. Because as my friend says, look, there's two possibilities. All the experts are telling us to wear a mask. They could be wrong, but if I listen to them and they're right, I'm actually loving my neighbor and I'm doing something that's positive for him. If I don't listen to them and I'm wrong, I'm exposing my neighbor to something that could kill them and my loved ones to something that could kill them. But let's say they're wrong. Let's say I listen to the experts and they're wrong. What's the worst that could come of that? I wear a piece of cloth over my mouth for a few weeks or a few months. Is that really a sacrifice? Paul tells us not to use our liberty as an obstacle, as something that could trip up our neighbor. But how many Christians are doing that right now as they raise the double bird to the rest of the world? Because First Amendment, damn it, or because Fox News, damn it. What kind of witness is that? What kind of testimony is that? I don't know. I don't know. Just those who have made wearing a mask part of a culture war are so obsessed and so sick in the head, so narrowly minded, that I have a feeling they belong in the category of the volitional doubtful. They're just in volitional doubt, and no matter what evidence you share with them, it won't mean anything. You could share evidence that masks are effective. You can quote all the best epidemiologists from around the world. You can show them the countries that didn't shut down but that masked up and have flattened the curve already. It's not evidence they're looking for. They're looking for confirmation bias. And the only thing they'll salute are other people who think just like them, because actually they don't want to know your opinion. They don't want to hear you voicing your own opinion. They want to hear your voice confirming theirs. This is a volitional doubt. This is what it means to have a hard heart. This is what it means to throw your wisdom before swine. Jesus says, don't waste your time and don't waste my testimony or my cred, our street cred. All right, I've talked too much. I thought that was a rather important examination because you could see how it plays out even in our day. Learning the difference between intellectual doubt and emotional and volitional doubt will make you a better parent. It'll make you a better teacher. It'll make you a really greater listener, a better lover. It'll also make you a greater witness for Christ. And it will save you. It will save you some really uncomfortable moments. Who wants to be trampled by a hog? With the boars, with the tusks, a boar with the tusks. Who wants to be rend into by that? Who wants to make that their daily, sport when they get home from work, to get on the internet and to be attacked by a bunch of raving wild boars? Do you want to do that? I mean, it's not doing any good. You're not going to persuade them. At best, maybe some in the audience will be persuaded, but is that the best use of your time, or is that the best use of God's time? I don't know. Peyton, what do you got for us? Let's see what you got. Oh, wow.
You were talking about planting seeds. So I made a farmer planting seeds.
That's a farmer.
Yeah, and this is a bird, flying away with its wormy. And those are its eyes, these are its wings, and these are its little feet.
So the early bird caught the worm. Is that what? That's kind of like a parable. Jesus never taught that one, but that's pretty good. It's a really sunny day. The bird caught the worm. The farmer is planting seeds. And there's some flowers?
Yeah, and it's raining. These
It's
are
raining.
the clouds, and this is the watering can.
So it's a sun shower. It's raining and it's sunny. Sun shower? And those look like sunflowers. Does he have like a red little cart? Like, is that?
Yeah, that's all the seeds, and this is a sign saying seeds. And he's saying seeds.
Oh, he's saying seeds. He's a sower. I like it. They call that sowing when you throw the seeds into the ground. All right. Well, thanks. Thank you, Peyton. You have any final things you want to say to the people?
I like birdies.
You like birds. I wanted to just say a couple things. Later today, noon my time, but 2 o'clock Eastern or 2 o'clock Central, I think it is, on BioLogos is featuring a live discussion between Francis Collins, the head of the National Institute of Health and the original founder of BioLogos, and the British theologian N.T. Wright. And they're going to be talking about what is a Christian response in the midst of the COVID virus. So if I didn't anger you by coming out in favor of masks, or even if I did anger you, you might want to see what these two other gentlemen have to say about it from their perspective. And maybe if you have some intellectual doubt about it, some of that will be satisfied. Until next time, thank you for watching. We love you all. We'll see you soon.